back for another look into console history, where this week we're going to look at the GameCube, how it was built, how it was supported, and why they made some of the choices that they made. Nintendo was currently coming off their first major loss in the console market in the N64 era, and wanted a way to fix some of the complaints that they had gotten from both customers and developers in relation to that system. You see, the N64 had a few issues related to its overly complicated silicon-based processor that made development far more complicated and expensive. The second problem it had was the fact that they had stuck to carts when a lot of systems, namely the PlayStation, had moved to more disc-based media. Carts had limitations in space and were getting more and more expensive to manufacture at the time, causing the cost of games for the systems to go upwards of $70, making it difficult to justify their purchase when similar and better quality games could be bought on Sony's wildly popular PlayStation for around $40. Nintendo wanted to fix these issues in their next console release, and in 1998, just 2 years after the release of the N64, began planning up a follow-up console called Project Dolphin. They were initially going to go with silicon graphics, but due to disputes over lowering the launch price of the N64 and multiple losses in leadership within the company itself, Nintendo no longer felt confident working with this company. Unfortunately, finding a new chip developer was getting more and more difficult, with all the top talent being pulled away into companies like Nvidia and NEC. Nintendo was running out of potential hardware partners at this point. They would eventually turn their sights to a small company called ArtX, made up of a group of engineers that had left Silicon Graphics sometime earlier, including Tom Van Hook and Wei Yin, the head designers of the Nintendo 64. Talks with Nintendo sparked a debate within the small company on whether or not they wanted to divert their limited resources to this project. Tom Van Hook had this to say about it. "We really didn't want to divert ourselves, but Nintendo made a pretty compelling argument, and it's a pretty huge opportunity, so we decided to go ahead in mid-1998, said Tom Hook, the chief designer for the N64 and the founder of ArtX. In the end, the deal was too good to pass up for the company, and a deal was made, but not everyone was happy with it. Silicon Graphics, for their part, filed a trade secret violation against ArtX, naming Tom Van Hook and Wei Yin specifically, and stating that they used secret information to draw Nintendo away from Silicon Graphics, stealing away their business. This would eventually be dropped, as Silicon Graphics didn't want to intimidate Nintendo, as it made up about $45 million of their annual revenue. Greg Butcher, for his part, stated the following: "They had given up on Silicon Graphics. The last of the people that they trusted were gone, and they went looking for people. It's not a company-to-company thing for Nintendo, it's a person-to-person thing." Nintendo had taken away a number of lessons with the N64. One was that the rising cost of carts hurt them by making games far more expensive towards the end of the console's lifespan. The other was that the system itself was incredibly hard to develop for. Howard Lincoln, reflecting back on the N64, stated the following: that coming out after Sony hadn't been what hurt them. It was the number of games which came down to issues with development tools, and we won't make that mistake again with the Dolphin. Miyamoto had a slightly different take on the situation, and he said that it was harder to develop for the N64, especially because the software libraries were delayed. However, the N64 truly brought developers into the era of 3D, and there were bound to be some problems with that. However, Nintendo was intent on making this a smoother transition for developers, which hopefully would lead to larger third-party support and more software on the new console. Greg Buckner, the head of ArtX, had this to say: "We thought about the developers as our main customers, in particular for the GameCube. We spent 3 years working with Nintendo of America and all sorts of developers, trying to understand the challenges, needs, and problems that they face. First among these is the rising cost of development. The GameCube can see high performance without too much trouble. It isn't a quirky design, but a very clean one. It's important that we didn't require jumping through hoops for high performance to be achieved. On top of that, it's rich in features, and we worked to include a dream group of technical features that developers requested. To that end, they put development into the capable hands of Dr. Wei Yin, the same man who had led the design of the processing chip for the N64, and he would head up this console's design as well. The thought was simple: deliver a simple architecture with a lot of power at a cost-effective price. They wanted to take the tack to putting developers first, allowing the system to be developed more quickly and as cheaply as possible, while providing the most amount of power that they could. One of the first things that they did is finally separate the audio circuitry from the CPU. This allowed the CPU to focus on processing commands to go to the GPU, get better audio from the dedicated audio processor. Sounds like a no-brainer by today's standards, but it was a first for Nintendo. They likely picked up on it after seeing Sony have so much success with their sound processing unit on the original PlayStation. After that was done, the team began working in earnest on the logic and graphics processor that they codenamed Flipper. This was a very clever processor that did a few neat things that allowed it to access assets quickly for display. One of the things that they did was set up a dedicated buffer in the main RAM for the two to be able to communicate quickly. The CPU would write the commands in, and the GPU would pick them up for display. Another clever thing that they did with this is that the GPU didn't have to be looking at the same one the CPU was looking at and could pull from a previous one while the CPU was writing the next one, reducing idle time of the CPU. Basically, they could work asynchronously. The GPU also had a dedicated command processor that was in charge of fetching things from the buffer, leaving the majority of the GPU's time dedicated to displaying the graphics. All of this lowered the consumption on the CPU side and allowed for a more efficient use of both the GPU and the CPU. ATI would later come in and purchase ArtX after almost all the design of the GPU was done, getting much of the credit for it when they really didn't contribute much to the construction of the processor itself. It did, however, get them into the console GPU development scene, making them a major player almost overnight. So I think it's time I kind of stop in the video and address the elephant in the room that always gets brought up with the GameCube, and that's the disk drive. Normally I wouldn't separate a part like this from the rest of the hardware discussion in a video, but there was a lot of talk back in the day of why Nintendo used this particular disk drive that they did. Perks and the downsides. When the GameCube first came out, many including myself were confused as to why they would go with a mini disc versus a full-size disc. For my part, I assumed it was Nintendo catering to a younger audience again, wanting to make sure that the disc was small enough for young children to be able to change the disc without causing any harm to the game disc itself. I always assumed that many felt this way during this time, and that it was also kind of due to the rather toy-like design and colorful controller that also seemed to go along with it that made it make sense that the disc was going to be designed around smaller hands holding it, or to keep the size of the console down. So, the actual reason, however, is quite a bit different. You see, the mini discs were actually used to try to help prevent piracy first and foremost. Secondly, Nintendo did not want to pay the license fee for DVDs in an effort to also keep costs down as low as possible. It was also argued that the smaller disc format meant that the laser had to travel less distance, reducing load times, but I couldn't find a whole lot of evidence to basically support that particular claim. This also seemed to work at least reasonably well, as it took people several years to start cracking the disc and pulling the ISOs off them. Even then, running a pirated disc on the actual GameCube didn't really work very well. However, given how much time has passed, someone may have managed to beat that particular issue as well by now. The downside to this format is the disc can only hold 1.5 gig of data versus 4.7 gig on a full-size DVD. The other downside to them was that using this format is the GameCube cannot play DVDs off the system without the Panasonic HD, which was only released in Japan, meaning there was no way to play regular DVDs in the console like you could in a PlayStation. This would lead into some complications that we're going to go ahead and discuss later on. While ArtX was working on the hardware design, Ishida Kenshiro and his team were busy working on the overall look of the GameCube. I'm just going to call it the GameCube from now on. The goal, according to Miyamoto, was to create a game system that looked like the ultimate game system and not another piece of audio and visual hardware that would sit on the shelf and not move. Okay, stop laughing everyone, stop it. He really meant it, okay? I didn't say that it did, I just said that's what they were going for. Kenshiro said that they first proposed several ideas that were less tall and more wide than what actually became the GameCube. He said it actually looked like something like UFO. None of these designs were working very well, so he took a closer look at how real gamers and their systems interact. He said that he wanted to make the Nintendo GameCube fit well into a user-friendly environment. The cube shape gives it the impression of a very compact system, especially when sitting on the floor. Nintendo found people got personally attached to their consoles and would often take it over to a friend's house or from room to room. So, they decided that they put a handle onto the system to make it look more friendly and portable. The next thing they wanted to do was to decide on the colors. They really liked the indigo color that they had going on from the logo, but they also discovered that many wanted a jet black version and that this would appeal more to the States and Japan as well. The last color they decided on for the initial release was a spice or an orange color that only ever got released in Japan. Now let's go ahead and talk about what they did with the actual controller. I mean, like many of Nintendo's more recent offerings at the time, the controller was kind of something of a debate among gamers when it came out. The controllers around this time had started to become more and more standardized, with the PS2 having the dual shock and having dual analog sticks, along with Microsoft following suit with their controllers. The GameCube took an odd turn to the left, bucking this popular trend and going with one analog stick and substituting the C buttons on the N64 controller for a C stick. They also took an interesting approach in making the A button, the most used button on a Nintendo controller, substantially larger than any other button. The controller was unique and caused a lot of stir, but it wasn't Nintendo's first design. One of the original designs for the controller itself included motion controls, if you can believe it. One of the controllers would pop off, the right side one giving you gyroscopic control of your game. This would eventually be scrapped in favor of the more iconic design, leaving us with one of the most comfortable, form-fitting controllers that Nintendo has ever made, if a bit odd and head-scratching in some of its placements. The motion controls wouldn't be completely dropped though, just pushed further down the line to hit Nintendo's immensely popular 7th gen system, the Wii. Now that Nintendo pretty much had most of the console on lockdown, they decided to go heavily into marketing the actual system. Now this time, they decided to market the GameCube like they had much of their other consoles, as strictly a console without really diving heavily into the entertainment console like the Xbox and PlayStation branded themselves. This meant they focused more on local co-op and offline play, even though a modem was available for the console itself. They, however, wanted to go after the 17 to 25-year-old age group that was finding online gameplay and more mature game content important. To reach these gamers, they took out marketing with both Maxim and Heineken in an attempt to appeal to this older demographic, while still doing campaigns like Cube Clubs, Nintendo Fusion Tours, and the Who Are You campaign in order to attract this demographic as well. According to GameSpot, he even went so far as to show off products like the Game Boy Advance at porn industry parties and nightclubs. They still seem to have issues attracting this crowd to their console, and Nintendo became increasingly confused with the West's interest in more violent video games that had become more prominent over the years. So, what happened? I mean, they basically designed the system exactly how they wanted to. It was easy to develop for, it was cheap to develop for, the console itself was inexpensive. So, what went wrong? Well, Nintendo had serious issues with this console from the start, and part of it was due to the lack of a major Mario game at launch. Most dismissed Luigi's Mansion outright. Many others were turned off by the more childlike appearance of the console and the bright indigo color that was predominant on the system at the time. To the growing gamer market, the system looked, well, childish. This image was compounded by the system's rather kid's lunchbox appearance that Nintendo had and the child-friendly reputation that they had garnered over the years. That meant that most gamers in the 17 to 25 age range just weren't interested. Nintendo, for their part, seemed confused by this change of focus and fixation on bloody and realistic games. They were also openly critical of the push on graphics, stating that it was too much of the focus on graphical fidelity and too little focus on gameplay, and the gaming market would suffer as a result. In reality, while Nintendo still made huge catalogs of great games, they had trouble shaking the kid-friendly image even to third-party developers who thought there wasn't enough of a market on the console to justify making games for it or porting existing games to it. People also criticized Nintendo for the art direction in Wind Waker. People disliked this new animated look and style, wanting a return to the more realistic style that they had come to enjoy out of Oregon at a time. That's not to say that this is all Nintendo had. They had many new IPs, and multiple games that were focused more on the age group that they were aiming for, like Metroid Prime and Fire Emblem. But people just didn't seem to care. My opinion on it is this. Most of the gamers Nintendo had from 1985 to the GameCube's launch in 2001 were the exact same crowd that had their first console be a Nintendo console. As they grew up, the console mostly kept to its original code and philosophy. Meanwhile, other players in the video game market came forward, like Microsoft and Sony with the PlayStation, focusing more on adult-themed games that began to appeal to the aging demographic that Nintendo had dominated. They also had multiple new IPs that they were developing. People were excited to play something new and different after having played so many of Nintendo's IPs over the years, which, realistically, started when a lot of third-party support began to leave the system around the N64. Nintendo was frankly struggling to adapt to the growing and changing market. Between Sega starting to expand the age group of gamers with the Genesis to the launch of the PlayStation, the gaming landscape had vastly changed in a very short amount of time. Nintendo just wasn't prepared to adjust that quickly. They lost touch with their market and the developers that were trying to draw back with this new architecture. It also didn't help that the PlayStation 2 acted as a DVD player and was roughly $200 to $300 cheaper than most of the DVD players at the time. In the end, Nintendo would fail to capture both in any scope that would put them back on top, selling only 22 million consoles versus 153 million PlayStation 2s. Even the Xbox would sell more in the end than Nintendo's plucky GameCube. At the end of the day, the GameCube didn't sell well, nearly as well as Nintendo wanted. It did, however, start several new important franchises for Nintendo, such as Metroid Prime, Breath of Fire, Beautiful Joe, Pikmin, and Luigi's Mansion, just to name a few. Many, not if all of these franchises, would go on to have life on other Nintendo consoles or other consoles, bringing us a whole host of new IPs. It's a little sad that more people didn't give the system a chance till much later, or many, like myself, just waited till the price dropped from $199 down to the almost criminally low $99 before they gave Nintendo's latest console a chance. Those that did found a robust library of some of Nintendo's most creative work since the Super Nintendo days, with tons of hits to justify far more than its humble asking price. Today, the console is remembered far more fondly than it was viewed back in the day that it launched, with game ports commanding retail prices or far more in the retro collecting market. This just goes to show how misunderstood and underappreciated that this console really was. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video on the GameCube and how much love and work was put into this little console. If you did enjoy the video, please give it a like. If you want, go ahead and check out some of my other videos that are on the screen now. Hopefully, you'll find enough of my content that you like that you'll do me a favor and subscribe and hit the notification bell so you know when I put up more videos like this in the future. Until next time though, have a wonderful day and happy gaming!